Welcome to the Civic Leader podcast. And today the theme is the brief that we will be discussing and reading is the brief called Poverty, published by the Policy Circle. And to do this, I have with me Karen Wells. I'm so honored that you are joining me for this conversation and reading of the Policy Circle brief on poverty. Karen, welcome to the Civic Leader podcast.
Thank you, Sylvie. I am so excited to talk about this and to participate in the brief. This is very personal for me, so thank you for the invite.
I know, and I want to give our audience a brief introduction of giving you about your background. So, Karen, you bring more than 25 years of corporate and entrepreneurial experience to bridge communities. You were just named their new CEO, so congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm excited about it.
You know, and prior to this, you've held several key leadership positions with McDonald's Corporation, including serving as a VP of U.S. Innovation, VP of U.S. Strategy, VP of Operations, and VP of Nutrition and Menu Development for McDonald's 13,000 U.S. restaurants. And along with other notable achievements, you led McDonald's negotiation team with First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move Children's Health Initiative. So that was a major turnaround for McDonald's.
It was. And frankly, it was my introduction to what you do now all the time, which is policy and how to impact policy. So it was a fabulous experience.
Yeah, and I remember telling me how you were kind of thrown into this world of policy and operations, kind of its own intersection.
I was.
So, and I guess beyond your Fortune 500 experience, you've owned and operated small businesses as a franchisee in early childhood development, and you are president and CEO of AEI Group, a company that you founded, based on your passion for philanthropy, leadership development, diversity, and inclusion. So you bring a wealth of experience to bridge communities, and you can also relate firsthand to the families of bridge communities and our topic because you grew up in poverty and you are a first-generation college graduate. So you're guided by your experience and your passion, and you are about to publish a book, The Pursuit of Courage. So congratulations on that accomplishment.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted now that my personal experience and journey, which is in my book, can now be coupled with my business experience for the greater good. Bridge Community provides transitional housing for families facing homelessness. And one of the topics we're going to talk about today is how the system supports or helps people in poverty, and yet there's this whole other world of how to help people get out of poverty, which are completely different dynamics. But we'll get to that a little later for sure.
Yeah, that's right. And it's been your passion, given your involvement in a number of program. You created a curriculum for Loaves and Fishes Community Services, a Moving Up program. Mm-hmm. And then you also volunteer on several program, and you are the Policy Circle leader of the Quad County Policy Circle. So that's amazing. So you've also, you've been featured in the Chicago Tribune and CNN, and you were named a rising star by Fortune magazine. So it's amazing that you are joining us to read this brief and also discuss the topic of poverty. So just for, the purpose of this recording is to read the brief. The Policy Circle briefs are at the center of every Policy Circle conversation. The goal for each circle is to really dive into a complex topic and for all of the participants of the Policy Circle to come prepared, having read a substantive brief that provides some background, a 360 on the issues, some of the facts to really help everyone frame their understanding and identify which needle they want to move in their own communities. That is really the goal. So today we will be reading the brief and having some conversations with Karen based on her experience, my experience, around the issue and the solutions to change, to make a change on this important topic. So Karen, I'd love to first, you've introduced a little bit your background. Would you like to add anything before we start reading the brief?
Sure. I just want to add, again, it's an honor to be here, Sylvie. Thank you for allowing me to participate. This topic of poverty is complex, and there's so many different perspectives and ways to look at it. And I'm grateful, having grown up in poverty, that there were some governmental solutions, but man, to address it and actually help to eradicate it, there's so many different avenues that I think we can explore. So I'm excited to kind of dive into the brief and add some texture and a little color to it from a personal standpoint, as well as some statistical and some facts that I've had a chance to take a look at that I think could complement this as well. So I'm ready to get started. I'm excited to do so.
Perfect. Well, let's get started. So
okay.
We'll be alternating reading the brief and conversation. So go ahead.
Well, I'm going to get started. And poverty has always been considered America has always been considered the land of opportunity. Unfortunately, individuals can find themselves trapped in a spiral of poverty, preventing them from reaching their full potential. This brief that Sylvie and I will have the pleasure of reading to you today and discussing covers what human creativity can accomplish in an entrepreneurial economy regarding the issue of poverty. So we'll review with you in this next hour or so the introduction, putting it into context, the role of government, current challenges and areas for reform, and then we'll have some discussion at the end. So let's get started. Historically, America has taken care of its poor by helping them improve their circumstances, which allows them to rise out of poverty. Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose New Deal laid the foundation for today's welfare programs with the Aid to Dependent Children program in 1935, believed welfare could tear apart the American spirit. He said, continued dependence upon relief induces a spiritual disintegration fundamentally destructive to the national fiber. To dole our relief in this way is to administer a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. Government assistance to the poor was never meant to keep people trapped in poverty, yet many of today's programs do just that. So if current policy is not working, what needs to happen to increase opportunity and upward mobility for all? Let's take a look at a brief case study. From Kimi Gray became a national figure because of her efforts to empower residents of public housing. She was the divorced mother of 5 children in her early 20s, living in one of Washington, D.C.'s most notorious open-air drug markets. Chronically neglected by the D.C. Housing Authority, the residents were often without heat or hot water for weeks at a time. Kimi took on management duties for her development. Within 6 months, she organized and hired residents and instilled discipline and a sense of hope that revived the entire complex. Even though she was a high school dropout, she managed to send all 5 of her children off to college, and countless residents sought her help in sending their children to college as well. As a consequence, Kimi created an initiative called College Here We Come that enabled 600 youths from her public housing development to attain higher education. The initiative made national news. Yet when 4 of the students came home on semester break, they were ashamed to bring their friends. That set Kimi on a quest to promote improvements in her complex. She was elected resident leader and galvanized the entire neighborhood in a massive restoration effort that drove out the drug dealers and promoted personal responsibility. Kimi's approach was no nonsense and entailed high standards. Her efforts virtually wiped out teen pregnancy and helped to make Kenilworth Parkside not only one of the safest places to live, but a place that saw a dramatic reduction in welfare dependency as well, according to Bob Woodson from the Ripon Society. You can see more about Kimi's life. As you can see, there's an embedded link for the C-SPAN interview. So why does this matter? Poverty has a human and financial price tag. And might I add, it also has an emotional and mental health price tag. Many people for whom poverty is a stark reality are less able to engage in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Studies have shown that poverty is a top predictor of stress and poor cognitive performance. Generational poverty plagues certain communities and creates cultural barriers to a better life. Poverty also costs big money. More than $23 trillion has been spent on poverty relief programs over the past 50 years, and yet the overall poverty rate has barely moved. This affects the entire population, from understanding how tax dollars go to social safety net programs to accounting for the massive debt caused in part by public spending and anti-poverty programs. If these expansive efforts are making little headway, finding ways to make lasting changes in people's lives at the local level, like Kimi Gray did, may be the key to alleviating poverty.
So, putting it in context. So, history. 2 centuries ago, most Americans, at least 90%, were desperately poor by today's standards. Most houses were small, ill-constructed, and poorly heated and insulated. Based on federal family income estimates, 59% of Americans lived in poverty as late as 1929, before the Great Depression. In 1947, the government reported that 32% of Americans were poor. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty, and by 1969, poverty had declined to 12%. Since, the percentage of poor Americans has remained nearly at the same level, ranging from around 11% to 15% since 1973. In 2014, it was 14.8%, about the same rate as in 1967. In 2018, it was 11.8%, representing 38.1 million people, and down a slight 0.5% from 39.5 million people in the 2017 census. In other words, poverty was declining in America before the huge growth in government spending on poverty programs. Despite U.S. taxpayers having spent approximately $23 trillion over 100 anti-poverty programs since 1965, there have been not been significant declines in poverty since. I'd like to add that we are recording this in a really unique time where unemployment rate is now reaching in the last month 14%. There's 33 million people unemployed because of the coronavirus crisis. And poverty is something that is really staring at many in our communities right now. So I'll continue on here with the numbers that we have, but it will be interesting to see how this gets updated later this year. According to the most recent census data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation in 2012, 21.8% of all U.S. families participated in at least one welfare program. This results in a hefty sum. The federal government spends $738 billion on 13 welfare programs in 2018. Adding in Social Security and Medicare, welfare programs amount to approximately 18% of the federal budget. In 2017, state and local governments spent an additional $231 billion on anti-poverty programs, including $59 billion on welfare programs and $172 billion in Medicaid. Data from the Organization of Economic Development, the OECD, show the US is the second highest social spender, 30% of GDP, across member countries, just before France, which is at 32% of GDP.
I would add to that, in looking at statistics from 2018, as it had mentioned, we were down to 11.8%, the poverty rate. And that was significantly down from 1993, where we suffered through not the pandemic type of issues, but in the 90s, we suffered through a significant amount of recession and unemployment at that time. So if history would repeat itself, we could see poverty rates going up 4 to 10% easily because of the pandemic. The sad point of this statistic is that we didn't note is that I think is worth noting two things. One is in that 11.8%, 16.2% are children in poverty. And so it really becomes, particularly as a mom, and having grown up, my mom was a mother of 7 children, single mom. So having all the children in poverty and how that impacts the long-term potential of children is pretty significant, even though that was a drop of 1.8% since 1993. I might note, as an African American, that Black Americans are the ethnic group with the most people living in poverty, in 2018 at 20.8% living below the poverty line, and for white Americans, it's at 8.1%. So there is, there's so much background that goes between that from an ethnic standpoint and from a demographic standpoint, that so many children are in poverty.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
No worries.
Yeah.
So let's talk about understanding poverty. To understand how to fight poverty, it helps to better understand the underlying causes. Those living in poverty are often cut off from the three crucial sources of support: education, work, and family. In their well-known success sequence, Brookings Institute scholars Ron Haskin and Isabel Sawhill identified 3 steps to joining the middle class: at least finish high school, get a full-time job, and wait until 21 to get married and have children. I definitely want to pause and make sure we talk about those 3 points later. Their research shows that 2% of American adults who follow those 3 rules live in poverty. 3 rules live in poverty, and about 75% join the middle class. Haskin and Sawhill acknowledge there are likely to be other influences at play, but following these rules guides a young adult away from poverty and toward the middle class. So let's talk about the types of poverty. Robert Woodson of the Woodson Center has addressed poverty in toxic urban centers for 40 years. He outlines 4 categories of poverty and how each requires different solutions, demonstrating that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for eradicating poverty. Woodson's testimony on poverty before the U.S. House Committee on the Budget outlines the following categories. First category are people who have experienced an unexpected setback due to circumstances out of their control, such as the loss of job, home, spouse, or other supporting family members. Assistance to them serves as a bridge back to economic stability. They use government programs as originally intended as an ambulance service and not as a transportation system. The second set are people stuck in the poverty trap. I like to call it generational poverty, who are trapped in a vicious cycle. They know that as they earn or save money, their benefits will be reduced or terminated. For many, even with a job, a reduction in benefits can make it difficult for nearly impossible to live. Therefore, the de-incentives for becoming independent outweigh the incentives. This also relates to intergenerational poverty, defined as poverty and welfare dependency spanning multiple generations within a family. And that is something that I had experienced. Number 3, people with disabilities and suffering mental illnesses, many of whom will always be in need of some support. The country's aging population may fall into this category. Number 4, people suffering from alcoholism and addictions are poor because of the chances they take and the bad choices they make. Giving no strings assistance to this group enables them to continue their self-destructive lifestyles and injures with the helping hand. For this group, intervention is a necessary precondition for assistance so that they can move to the ranks of category 1, where assistance and opportunities can be a stepping stone towards self-sufficiency and upward mobility. If it were just that simple. It's so much more complicated than that, but that's a good starting point.
It's a good start, Jan. There's a couple of things. So my family, my father was the first one in his family to get a college degree. Comes from a family of 11 children. My grandmother was a widow and then remarried and then a single mother. And in rural Quebec, where there were really no support, no resources, and my father had to trap rabbits to bring back home to eat, as well as slept in the schools where he went. There was no real public school system at the time that he was growing up. There's one dimension here is rural poverty is not really mentioned here, and I'm not sure where it would fit in with where there's a lack of opportunities. There's just a lack of opportunity from the environment that you are part of. So that's one piece that I think is not mentioned here. And I think like the gap in access to internet, to resources in remote communities really prevent them from actually really achieving their full potential and get out of poverty. So that's one dimension that I feel is not really represented here. And I think, Karen, I'd love to hear your other thoughts on these categories.
Yeah, I think that there's 2 things talk about, I don't think enough time was spent on what I call generational poverty or intergenerational poverty. That is such a significant barrier to breaking the poverty cycle or continuum, because it's all you know. It's what your grandma was, it's what your mom was, what your uncles and aunts are. And so it really prevents children growing up in this environment and becoming adults to know that there's this other world out there that doesn't have to be ingrained in poverty. And I think that there is the mental piece of that can be so difficult. Such was the case for my family. We juggled somewhere between 1 and 2 before my mom left and fled my dad due to domestic violence. We were living middle class Midwest, so we thought. I mean, we had a house, we had, running water. That all was good to me. And then when she fled and we left, and a single parent with an 8th grade education with 7 children, she actually had 9 surviving children, 2 were out of the house. It just became increasingly difficult. And we went back to the life that she came from, which was generational poverty. So, my point is that there's just so many different dynamics. And even with the billions and trillions of dollars spent, I want to talk about, another way for us to take a look at how we could address it.
Yeah, it's true that I think this category 2 of the people stuck in the poverty trap, a better term would be this intergenerational poverty, I think, too.
Right.
And then even it could be even like teased out.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let's talk about the role of government. We'll have a discussion around that. Historically, government has played a central role in alleviating poverty, particularly since the New Deal and the War on Poverty were implemented. Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute notes that most people believe the government has a moral obligation to help those who, through bad luck or unfortunate circumstances, can't help themselves. What government actions should be is where there tends to be more disagreement. Some favor an approach that emphasizes improving the immediate material living conditions of people in poverty and reducing income differences. Success in the war on poverty is viewed in terms of how many people are receiving the help they need and of programs that equalize income to reduce poverty, including increasing minimum wage, expanding long-term unemployment benefits, spending more money on current or new poverty programs, imposing higher tax rates on high earners to fund additional safety programs. Others believe policies must encourage people in poverty to seek work to improve their lives and incentivize economic growth and job opportunities. According to Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute, the policy focus should be less on making poverty comfortable and more on creating the prosperity that will get people out of poverty. People need work opportunities where they can experience earned success, as noted by Arthur Brooks. Work is an opportunity for everyone to add value, including those with physical and intellectual disabilities. Through work, people feel needed and valued, become part of a community, and learn responsibility. Children can also see the value and reward of hard work to better their lives and help break the generational cycle of poverty. According to the 2017 Census Bureau Income on Poverty data, the poverty rate for all workers was 5.3% for full-time year-round workers, and for full-time year-round workers was 2.2%. The poverty rate for those who did not work for at least 1 week during the year was over 30%. So work is a big component on it, but the piece that also goes with work is the ability to connect to those jobs and the ability to get to those jobs. There's that connection, right?
I completely agree. I think a lot of people feel, I do some work studying the different socioeconomic classes with Ruby Payne and in a group in the AHA process, but a lot of people think that if people would just pull up their bootstraps, get an education, work hard, they can get out of poverty. And I did a presentation at one point in time talking about this, and I read a quote from Martin Luther King, and it says, it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he should just lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. And so oftentimes what I found with people struggling in poverty, as I said before, it becomes a little difficult, some of the socioeconomic and even ethnic differences in access to education and access to resources. And the welfare system becomes a penalizing system at times to even get out of poverty. And you allude to that, we allude to that sometime later in the brief. Statistically, the Pew Research said that a charitable trust indicated that out of 10 people in poverty, 70%, 7 out of 10 will remain in poverty. About 3 will rise to the middle class, and 1 out of 10 will actually get into the upper middle class or in that top 1%. Sylvie, that is the exact statistics of my personal family. My mom had 9 children, and we played that statistic out to the letter of the law, to the actual percentage. So it becomes increasingly difficult to break the cycle, but it is possible with some of the resources that I have a chance to participate in if they were readily accessible.
Yeah. Let's continue that conversation. So analysis and accountability. Another step in making government work better for people is analyzing whether or not programs are actually effective by tracking metrics and providing accountability of funds. This is the goal of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission Act, passed by the House and Senate, signed by President Obama in 2016. The act established the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which focuses on properly using data to improve how government programs operate. The federal government is in a position to supervise by setting benchmarks, publishing results, and ensuring that states are not misusing taxpayers' funds. The role of federal government should be coordinated, targeted, evidence-based, and in line with the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That is, the federal government is to act as a referee, not as a player. So I think that is interesting. A lot of times there is so much emotion attached to poverty programs, and sometimes it's really hard to apply the metrics and to be honest in looking at, well, what works, what doesn't work, and to also take into account the qualitative aspect of it, but the emotional aspect of it, where it's very hard for people to leave the environment that they know to seek work somewhere else in a space where you don't know anyone, in a different city. And my family experience, it was really hard for people to leave a rural community to go to the city to get a job. And a lot of times they do that and then they go back because they cannot live in that environment. And they rather live in worse conditions than to uproot themselves. And I think that dimension, that human behavior dimension, that need for connection and is hard to represent in numbers, and is hard to represent in accountability and to account for when designing program and implementing programs.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because in the Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By world and Bridges Out of Poverty model that I subscribe to with Ruby Payne and the AHA process, and I have a chance to facilitate, it talks about just that. There's different dynamics between the socioeconomic classes, and you just nailed it. And research actually confirms what you just said, which is for families in poverty, the most important thing that they have, the thing that they know that they can control and that they can have regardless, are the relationships that they have. That is the most valuable thing. Sometimes to a fault, sometimes it can be very unhealthy. But if there's anything that people in poverty can count on, it's relationships. For people in the middle class, it's achievement. For people in the wealth, it's about connection. So everyone has something that is important to them. And for people in poverty, it is about relationships. I'll go back to the role of government that you read. Increasing minimum wage and long-term benefits, all that's great, but it is not coupled with some type of financial literacy for people coming out of poverty, we're going to end up back in the same place that we were. Case in point, me, I'm out, I got out of poverty, I'm a debt-free woman, all that is great. But my first job out of college, I made $26,000 a year, but I spent $60,000. So I had $40,000 worth of credit card debt. Because I had no idea how to manage money back then. I just thought, oh my gosh, I have access to it. And so, and it's the proverbial story of someone in poverty hitting the lottery and then they're broke in a year. Why? Because there's no financial literacy that I think is one of the things that has to be coupled with this idea of getting out of poverty.
Yeah, and having a different mindset. And I think Rudy Payne actually talks about that, having this different mindset around the relationship of money and
absolutely
managing, having a mindset of managing your wealth as an asset for your well-being instead of something that you just spend every day. And it's a very different mindset. And yeah.
It is
so
a different
Karen,
mindset.
Why don't you read about the safety net?
Sure. The safety net, the social, and there's a chart there in the brief, but the social safety net, according to the federal safety net, the social safety net of the United States is made up of various welfare programs that protect low-income Americans from poverty and hardship. The theory is that by catching Americans if they fall on hard times, Americans of sound body and mind can get back on their feet. And for those individuals without sound body and mind, the safety net protects them with the minimum standard of living. Federal poverty level guidelines based on census data of the number of Americans in poverty establish financial eligibility for these programs. And might I add that my mom and family would have been at that $43,000, should have been, to be, in poverty. And back in her days when she was making $1.25 an hour, she should have been making $2.12 just to meet that guideline if you do net present value backwards. So statistics also show that in order for people to be out of poverty, they need to make at least 3.5 times of the numbers that is on this particular chart. So the social safety net includes both contributory and non-contributory programs. For contributory programs such as Social Security and Medicaid, Americans pay into the programs during their working years and receive benefits later in life. Other programs are non-contributory transfer payment programs, meaning low-income Americans don't have to contribute into the programs to receive benefits. 13 categories of welfare programs are shown on the Safety Net Programs page. State programs and nonprofit organizations also make up the social safety net available to Americans. These programs vary by location and typically include food, housing, counseling, and other benefits. Some of the more commonly known programs are Medicaid, a joint federal state program designed to provide health coverage to low-income families, single mothers, and disabled individuals. We did receive that when we were growing up. Earned Income Tax Credit, which provides cash assistance to low-income working families, and is designed to offset Social Security taxes and to do so in a way that encourages work. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which replaced the New Deal era aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, which is what I grew up in. It offers fixed annual grants to states and gives states much flexibility in designing their own programs with grants and institutes work requirements and time limits on aid. And then the supplemental SNAP assistance program, back when my mom was receiving it, it was known as food stamps, also known as food stamps as you see there. SNAP helps low-income families buy food so they can maintain a healthy diet. And then housing assistance that comes in the form of HUD programs such as Section 8 vouchers, and families seeking assistance may apply through Public Housing Authority for more than one kind of assistance, and they can accept assistance through various programs based on their eligibility. Back when my mother was receiving food stamps, that's when they were giving out blocks of cheese, peanut butter, powdered eggs, and powdered milk. And we were recipients of all of those. And to this day, I cannot eat a scrambled egg at all. Will not, shall not. An egg white, but not a yellow egg ever again.
Well, it's interesting. I think like the complexity of all of these programs, and there's a chart I think later on, and that is incredible. But all of these programs, I'd like to add that in Congress there is an oversight committee, a congressional committee that oversees each of these programs, and they might be part of the agriculture, the Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Agriculture, and there's a subcommittee on SNAP. They're part of all subcommittees. So each of those are overseen by Congress, and they also, and it's not outlined here, they belong to different departments, right? They belong to different departments.
Wow.
So there's all these silos, right? Because some are part of USDA, some are part of Treasury, some are part of HHS, some are part of HUD. So there's silos even separating these programs instead of just a very integrated way that is a wholesome approach to providing really evidence-based programs that are really effective in making a difference. That's
I agree.
To add. So current challenges and areas for reform. So one is measuring poverty. Currently, poverty in the US is measured according to the thresholds that represent the minimum amount of cash income required to support households, known as the official poverty measure, the OPM. This does not include benefits, not in the form of cash, such as public housing or food stamps. In 2011, the Census Bureau introduced the Supplemental Poverty Measure, SPM, which defines the needs and income of households more broadly by accounting for benefits other than cash and considering average expenditures on food, clothing, housing, and utilities, as well as geographic adjustment for housing costs. How poverty is measured makes a great deal of difference. The SPM suggests the real poverty rate is 5 to 6% lower than the OPM, the official poverty measure. And there is a chart here that just like to point out, there's about 8 different levels of poverty. Oh, no, it's for families, households with more than 8 people need to add an extra $4,000 for each additional person. So one person, the poverty guideline is $12,000, $12,490. For a family of 8, it's $43,430. There's a chart here that really shows the numbers.
Yeah. For that family to actually survive, they would need a family of 8, and I still think would be a low number, literally over 120,000 for them to even try to think about breaking even.
And it varies based on cities also and the cost of living in the environment that you are in.
Absolutely.
So the anti-poverty programs. So anti-poverty programs suffer from duplication overlap across agencies, which cause inefficiencies and waste. So there's a picture here of the labyrinth nature of the welfare system. And there's a big chart that illustrates this. And I invite you to go to thepolicycircle.org to see this brief and see the chart. So for example, there are 32 federal housing programs run by 5 different cabinet departments. There are 11 different healthcare insurance and assistance programs administered by the Office of Personnel Management, Department of Defense, and 5 agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2018, the federal government spent $68 million on SNAP and other food assistance programs. The amount of SNAP benefits paid in error increased to 6.8% in 2018 from 6.3% in 17, amounting to about $4 billion paid out in error. Medicaid made $36.2 billion in improper payments in 2018. And in 2018, the Department of Labor improperly paid $88 million in unemployment insurance. The Social Security Administration improperly paid $4.8 billion in supplemental security income, and the IRS improperly paid an estimated $18.4 billion in earned income tax credits. So that information is found on payment.accuracy.gov. So there's this incredible chart I can't even read with a ton of boxes of describing all of the different programs. We are spending an extraordinary amount of taxpayers' money on fighting poverty, yet the poverty rate remains roughly the same. Streamlining these programs to avoid duplications and overlap may add some relief to the overburdened and costly system, particularly for programs that overlap. Program staff often spend time on duplicative work. A USDA report even noted that food and nutrition services could potentially achieve cost savings by taking actions to eliminate duplication and overlap in its 15 different food assistance programs. Unnecessary steps add to administrative and operating costs and can lead to mistakes that increase both overpayment and underpayment. A different solution could focus on where federal dollars are invested based on a study done by Civic Enterprises. An annual federal investment of $6.4 billion a year in proven existing federal programs like AmeriCorps, Back on Track Schools, Public Allies, Service and Conservation Corps, or Youth Build programs would reconnect 1 million youth adults every year. Each reconnection to education and employment could directly save taxpayers $236,000 and will save a total social cost of $704,000. Thus, if these programs succeed with just half of their participants, the lifetime direct return on investment to taxpayers would be of over $118 billion for each year of investment. I think the key point here is being able to look at all of the programs across agencies to really streamline. That's a major undertaking for any one agency to take. I'm not sure what agency would oversee this, right? I know it's maybe it's OMB, but you would need to have all agencies commit and being on board with this goal of potentially eliminating a program that they own. That's really hard to accomplish in a government structure.
Yeah, it particularly between in a bipartisan way, and not a lot of committees give up control and purview and what they're responsible for. So it would take years to do, but man, it would be worth it. I had no idea until I read the brief how much money is available to families that are struggling through this poverty continuum. It's enough to break the cycle if it were all coordinated in a way that didn't, as Ruby Payne says it, just aid in the tyranny of the moment. Many of the programs address a right now problem. My lights are turned off, my water's turned off, and these are all really important. But there are very few agencies and programs that talk about how can we help you become self-sufficient? How can we help you with financial literacy? It's just, the scales are so tipped on solving the current crisis as opposed to solving the long-term problem.
And really, for people seeking help, it's so complicated. That's what I keep hearing, right? It is so complicated, all of these siloed programs, that you end up spending your days waiting in line to meet with a social worker at the Social Security office or filling out forms. And it becomes so much that you can't have the energy then to really think through, okay, how can I break this cycle that I'm in? You're spending all this time just trying to get the funds to survive. So I think the complexity of it all is also a big hurdle that will not that prevent us from truly addressing this issue in our country.
I think and I shamelessly will plug a couple of programs that try to do that, which is the Moving Up program that you referenced earlier, that really works on through Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By world, by Phil DeVoe and Ruby and the team, works on how do you help people that are in poverty change the mindset. Because if you can change the mindset, you can change a whole lot of things, right? And one of the parts of that is really grappling with the fact that I am poor, which, believe it or not, many of our investigators in this class don't even realize that they're living in poverty. Why? Because this is the way they've lived always, And it's sad, but once you realize that, which can be debilitating from a trauma standpoint, then you can start thinking in the abstract and figure out, how you can do better. The Bridge program that I've had the honor of leading, this organization has a 35-year history of surrounding the families that we serve for 2 years. So it's not like I'm going to give you a house to stay because you're today homeless. It's let me put you in this 2-year program surrounded by mentors who will meet with you weekly and help you with financial literacy and all these other outside agencies that's going to help you get to even first and then to get ahead. That it takes between 2 on an aggressive plan to 5 years to break the cycle of poverty with a ton of support. So I just am an advocate that we've got to work on the traumatized, because most people in poverty are traumatized with no mental health help, and then surrounding resources to become self-sufficient in addition to helping in the moment.
Yeah, I think I would highly recommend reading that book, Framework for Understanding Poverty by Rudy Penn.
I have that.
It's absolutely brilliant, because the pieces of it are not just material. It's very much in the mindset and also what to break the cycle. If you don't know that you are in a cycle, you're not going to break it, which was your point earlier. But that book is really great. So I will learn more about the Move Up program, because Rudy Payne is phenomenal on just understanding the framework. I mean, this brief provides the facts and the dollars around the policies.
Right.
But to understand how to break the cycle, that book is really a must read or listen. I've listened to the audio version, which is really great.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a bit.
Read the poverty trap.
Yep. Let's talk about the poverty trap.
Yeah.
People fall into the poverty trap or the welfare trap when what they earn at a job is not much more than what they can get from the government by not working, which functions as a disincentive to work more. Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute explains the poverty trap in this 5-minute clip, which is in the brief, and I had a chance to look at it, and it was pretty telling, from Prager University. Dozens of different welfare programs often impose high effective marginal tax rates that make it harder for low-income people to transition out of these programs and into the middle class. The tax rates can discourage work, and it has fee in parentheses. A marginal tax rate is the percentage of an additional dollar of earnings that is unavailable to an individual because it is paid in taxes or offset by reduced benefits from the government programs. For example, the 2015 median marginal tax rate for households just above poverty line, I found this astounding, was about 34%. Are you kidding me? This means that for each additional dollar of income a family in this range earns, the family would lose about 1/3 of this additional dollar to taxes or lost benefits. This was the highest marginal tax rate of any income level, showing that earned income rises, that as earned income rises, declines in unearned income offset large portions of the gain. He basically said, and I had to write it down, that, and you'll see it in the video, that a family making $20,000 a year would literally have to leap to an additional $25,000 in order to make up for all the lost benefits that they're going to continue to be declined from as a result of making more money. So there is no incentive to even, because who's going to make a 120% increase in a year? Not many. So I just found that this was amazing. I have so many families that I've helped that, even in the Moving Up program, that she wanted to get a job. As soon as she got a job, she had no insurance for her twin toddlers. And so she's an educated, but they can't afford not to be insured. I mean, it is a vicious cycle.
And then is the Georgia Opportunity Center created a calculator in Atlanta. So based on your location in Atlanta, like which county, because there's different tax rate, and it kind of shows how it calculates how much more you need to be making in order to maintain kind of your same level of benefits and revenues that you are getting from the government. And then there is definitely, and they call it kind of the poverty cliff, where you just can't, like the leap, just as you described, the leap that you have to make in terms of income just to get the benefit, the insurance, the food stamps, to get those benefits is unrealistic given the levels of education and opportunities available in the areas. So that is a project I know that several, the Georgia Opportunity Center is really working on making that calculator also available to other states, so that it's a useful tool when you're designing state-based poverty alleviating policies.
Right. It's interesting because one of the other challenges for families breaking the cycle of poverty, I know particularly here in DuPage County, is the percentage of their income that goes towards living. The household income, I mean, what you pay in rent or mortgage should technically not exceed 30, maybe 40%, but in most cases, families in poverty in DuPage County, I can tell you, are paying upwards of 50%. One of their checks is going towards rent. And therefore, that means something will not be covered by the end of the month. Something is going to go astray. And so I think that's another piece that somehow has to be calculated into this whole picture of the struggle to break the cycle, because the cost of living far outweighs what wages are. So let's read on the local approach. Often programs to eradicate poverty are designed by those unfamiliar with local conditions, better understood by local leaders who have the knowledge and the credibility necessary to implement change. Designing programs at the local level allows the assistance to be tailored to fit the needs of those in poverty. For example, the private community-based organization, the Woodson Center, provides effective community and faith-based organizations with training and technical assistance, and links them to sources of support and evaluates their experiences for public policy. The Woodson Center provides training to more than 2,600 leaders of community organizations in 39 states and helps community residents deal with issues such as youth violence, substance abuse, teen pregnancy, and homelessness, joblessness, family dissolution, poor education, and deteriorating neighborhoods. For example, one Milwaukee-based program under the umbrella of the Woodson Center, the Violence Free Zone Initiative, is reducing violence and disruption in 12 Milwaukee public schools and is preparing students in the most disadvantaged communities to learn and to succeed. In his column for the Ripon Society, Robert Woodson of the Woodson Center writes, "History clearly demonstrates that achievements against the scourge of poverty must originate among those experiencing problems. It begins with a belief that self-development is possible, and no matter what circumstance, they have the capacity to be agents of their own uplift." Might I add that that is the absolute premise of the Moving Up program and getting ahead and just getting by world. Woodson knows there's no magic policy lever we can pull to eradicate poverty. However, there are effective community-based models that are successfully solving some of our nation's most intractable problems. Empowering the states and communities on the front lines can truly break down barriers to opportunity and make the safety net more effective. Now, in the organization that I don't start leading until June 1, but what's beautiful about it is that for the 2 years that they're in transitional housing, they pay no rent. So you have a substantial amount of your income that most people in poverty are paying just to stay housed. You now have an opportunity to save that amount, and many of our families have not enough income to make a down payment on a house or a condo, or they leave with the reserves that you're teaching in financial literacy for 3 or 6 months, so that when they get out on their own, they're not, back into a situation due to a problem. And it's a very generous way to try to help families actually get kind of a jump start, which is so difficult when you're in a hole.
Yeah, we would say that's part of the housing first kind of model, like first provide housing to stabilize housing, and then people can really start working on becoming self-sufficient through education or different programs.
I would agree with that. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got to make sure that people are housed appropriately. And I remember it as a child. We were evicted many times. And it really causes so much disruption in schooling and, education, and just so many in the psyche of a child and of a parent, that if you could stabilize housing and, have some supportive programs around it, you can help people think and get past, that huge tyranny of the moment, particularly a lot of single parents. So I agree with that. I'm excited that we can do that. I told one family that I'm mentoring that it's like, Bridge Communities or other organizations that provide transitional housing is writing a $60,000 check, a free check, that you don't have to pay back. I mean, it is such a blessing if you have the learning and the training around it to use those saved funds in a way that's going to help you in the future.
Yeah, I think what's also highlighted here, and maybe could be highlighted even more, is the importance of these local programs. Because I know here on the north side, I was involved in an organization called Housing Opportunities for Women, which has a similar model of stabilizing housing and then offering the programs to really get people to become self-reliant, and they start paying most of their rent. But this idea of finding the programs that are local, and maybe it needs to be even at I think a smaller unit than even counties, because it's really communities. And it kind of gives you to pause to think about, well, all right, in our village, in our community, what is the poverty alleviation program, or, that is part of our community? Because every community has poverty in one form or another.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you don't even know about it, but it's still there in different capacities. And I think that's not, how do you make that real, right? How do you measure the effectiveness? How do you construct these programs so there's a collaboration instead of just a fragmentation of piecemeal program? I think that's the biggest challenge for all of the social organizations tackling, is how our effort coordinated, measured, and to really achieve the one goal.
Yeah, I am convinced, and I can tell you from my own personal story, that while, I had access to education, and that I happened upon that really, but it literally takes a village to raise a child and to help people break the cycle of poverty. And if we can if we can influence interagency collaboration for the greater good of, we're literally serving the same person and doing all these different things. I think the organization that I'm serving now has really brought together, I must be, 10, 20 different agencies around the families that we serve, because you can't be experts in everything. But that's a big challenge for agencies to work collectively together, because everybody's fighting for the same resources and fighting for the same people that making grants. And gosh, if we can figure out a way, and some people are doing it well, to get beyond that, we could really better serve the community.
Yeah, there is actually I'll have to tell you more about it, but there is an organization called, a startup in Chicago, it's called Solve.is, and it's essentially a platform to keep track of and measure really the effectiveness of all of these programs that could be available for people to really achieve their full potential. So connecting employers to people in underserved communities who need a job, but also connecting those people with all of the services that they need to support their flourishing. So that might be something worth also looking into. But I think this fragmentation, or looking at this coordination, and it takes so much, it's almost impossible for a program to say, you know what, you guys do it a lot better than we do. So we're just going to be absorbed by yours. I don't know how you start that. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't, but it does have to be absorption. It really has to be collaboration. There are a lot of things that, bridge communities, loaves and fishes, moving up, don't do well, but we go out and try to find other people who do, and figure out, can we work together for the greater good of the people we serve? That to me is a better model than gobbling them up. Yeah,
that's right. That's true. Right.
In the entrepreneurial spirit.
That's right. Well, okay. Here's a new section here. Indirect measurements of poverty, wealth, and income. Poverty is an indirect measurement of assets, debts, and income. The value of assets, such as houses, savings, and stock, minus the debt, such as mortgages and credit card balances, is referred to as wealth. Between 1998 and 2016, the U.S. economy roughly doubled, meaning everyone got wealthier. In recent years, however, debt has become a burden for many Americans. For 2019, consumer debt, not counting mortgages, has climbed to $4 trillion, higher than it has ever been, even after adjusting for inflation. Student debt totaled about $1.5 trillion last year, exceeding all other forms of consumer debt except mortgages. Auto debt is up nearly 40% of adjusting for inflation in the last decade to $1.3 trillion. And this is quoting a Wall Street Journal article. This is really important information, especially at this time in this pandemic where people are being furloughed, losing their jobs, and realizing that they do not have the funds to survive for 2 months, for 6 months. So this is an important information. As of 2019, the bottom half of all U.S. households have just begun to regain the wealth lost in the financial crisis and still have about 1/3 less wealth than they did in 2003. The top 1% of households have twice as much wealth as they did in 2003. Much of this disparity comes from differences in assets. More than 85% of the assets of the top 1% are in stocks and bonds. 85%. Just over half of assets owned by the bottom 50% of households is in the form of real estate. While a strong stock market can increase financial assets, home prices have outpaced income since 2009, which makes it harder to purchase a home and leaves many households without a real estate asset. So again, today, in the last 2 months, the stock market lost over 40% of its value. So that everything here is probably very different today. Income.
And I felt that, and you felt that. Now, the people in poverty didn't feel it as much. They're feeling it in the form of lost jobs.
Right. Income refers to cash received during a year from working, dividends, interest, rents, and government programs. This is from the Urban Institute. After World War II, incomes across the distribution grew at about the same rate until 1970s, when disparities began. How large these disparities actually are is not set in stone and depends on which measurements economists use when studying income. In 2017, the Census Bureau published data saying that the top 20% of households had 17 times as much income as the bottom 20% of households. When looking at the amount earned in a paycheck, this may be accurate, but when looking at the total disposable income, the results are different. The Census Bureau measurement was taken before taxes and transfers, ignoring the 80% of all taxes paid by the top 40% of households and the 70% of all public transfer payments that go to the bottom 40% of households. So studies focusing on income inequality can find markedly different results depending on whether they account for taxes and transfers. Examining income inequality between 1979 and 2014, Pickett, Says, and Zuckman in 2018 found the wealthiest 10% receiving 55% of income growth. CBO in 2018 finds that the top 10% receive 46% of growth. And Otten and Splinter 2018 report that the top 10% receive 31% of income growth. So that's an interesting fact when you read the paper, and the policy circle is about going beyond the headlines. So this is something, whenever you read an article about poverty, you could go back to this section and say, okay, what are they saying here?
Yeah.
And ask those questions, right?
Exactly.
So where studies have shown similar trends is in examining incomes since the Great Recession. Young people were hit especially hard by the recession, and the slow recovery has meant lifetime earnings are measurably lower for millennials. In 2019, Deloitte study found the average net worth of millennials, 18 to 35, is less than $8,000. But things may be looking up. In 2019, US workers under 35 reported being happier with their paycheck than people over age 55 for the first time since 2011.
Can I add there though?
Yeah.
You can't, there's so much that's almost a little loaded only because the mentality and what's valued by millennials very different than what's valued by boomers.
Oh, that's really good.
And you know what I mean? And so they could be making significantly less, but if they're in a job that's engaging, that they can relate to, and that feeds into their purpose, they are a lot happier. So there's a lot that goes into the psyche between the two beyond the numbers.
Right. That's a really great color here. Median weekly earnings rose 5% from the end of 2017 to the end of 18. The middle class was also demoralized throughout the recession and recovery. Longer working hours combined with increasing costs of education, healthcare, and housing have caused many to fear that they could fall out of the middle class altogether. When baby boomers were in their 20s, 70% were in middle class. Today, for millennials, that number is just 60%. In fact, in terms of net income, the average middle class household earns 13% more than the average household in the bottom 20% and works more than twice as many hours a week, but still somehow only has 32% more net income. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Census data published in 17 also found that although the median income for urban dwellers jumped 5.4% last year to $61,521, households in rural area saw their earnings basically stagnate at less than $46,000. It's from the LA Times. Figures from the Institute for Research on Poverty show this is nothing new. Monthly poverty rates for rural areas are almost 4% higher than annual poverty rates reported by the Census Bureau. In 2016, urban poverty was 12% and rural poverty was 16%. So, other solution, and Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you for these other concepts around alleviating poverty.
So the Universal Basic Income, UBI, is a highly controversial concept defined as guaranteed cash benefit that the government provides to all citizens, and has garnered renewed attention as a method of streamlining the current complicated and sometimes counterproductive system of U.S. transfer programs. Critics maintain UBI is not ideal for redistributive purposes, and pursuing a pro-work, pro-skills agenda that invests in human capital would do more than a simple handout to advance both individual economic security and aggregate productivity. Let's talk about the $15 minimum wage. And as a small business owner, this one was very, very controversial for me. Another heated debate in terms of poverty and income is the movement for a $15 minimum wage. Proponents argue that the current minimum wage of $7.25 is not a livable wage, and a Congressional Budget Office analysis found that raising the minimum wage to $15 would increase paychecks for 27 million workers and pull 1.3 million Americans out of poverty. Disney, Target, and Amazon, and now McDonald's, have made plans to raise their minimum wages to $15 an hour in the coming years. Those against the hike point to the same study, which also found another 1.3 million Americans could be forced out of their jobs. Skeptical economists note labor conditions and cost of living vary across the country, and a one-size-fits-all policy that more than doubles some businesses' wage bills could force layoffs or even business closures, according to the New York Times. Some research also shows higher minimum wages lead employers to reduce their benefits for employees and shift towards automation. In Seattle, wages rose 3%, but hours decreased by 6 to 7%. Overall, the amount of money paid out in the low-wage labor market actually declined due to the reductions in hours, according to Econ Talk. See which states have passed minimum wage laws in the National Council of State Legislators. That's a link that is in the brief. Just a side on this. When we were small business owners of childcare, early childhood development, we grappled with this issue. Over half of our income was our payroll. And so you take that type of hike, and even though some of our teachers made that amount, I struggled as a person who came from poverty because I'd like to pay as much as I possibly can so that the families that are serving our other families aren't in poverty. But I also try to figure out how in the world will I stay in business if we go to that amount. It was a really tough call. We did it through compression, and we were able to slowly, take a few of our teachers up and up until we were past this $15 on average. But that was over the course of time, and not many businesses can do that. And we were a high-level childcare center, and so we were able to charge, more, which one could argue is already unaffordable in childcare. So it's a catch-22, clearly.
It really is, and also I think it's important to look at the numbers of who is on minimum wage, because minimum wage is not ever meant to be livable wage necessarily. So when you look at the numbers, it's people who are, a lot of them, part-time or young people. There's a lot of analysis there, and I think we have another brief around this whole issue. But it always ends up being, well, people work less hours, or they eliminate jobs, and this becomes a warrant for automation. And you already see it in McDonald's, for instance. Mm-hmm. McDonald's, especially in Europe and other countries, has really automated a lot of jobs. Mm-hmm. So those same people then found themselves without a job, and a way to actually gain some basic skills to get them to the next level. So it's a really heated debate. And then I feel this one size fits all approach is not necessarily the best one. It should not necessarily be federally mandated.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got Cook County already at, what is it, 10 or 12 bucks an hour? I can't read. They're already above me. I've hired no one at minimum wage. Who can live off of minimum wage? Maybe a teenager to buy clothes, but no one can live off of minimum wage.
Right.
But yeah, so you have other counties taking it into their own hands. I think where Congress has not considered, and hopefully they have a task, force looking at it, is the implications on small business, which now in the pandemic has already taken a huge hit. It's just a catch-22. It's so complicated.
It's so complicated. Yeah, it really is. That's a whole brief on its own, because
it really is
divided on this. So
it really is. Well, let's talk about innovative solutions. Wage supplements. The Poverty Reduction Opportunity Wage is an idea for wage supplementation that aims to configure a wage subsidy so that if a person works full-time, they will not be in poverty. If a person or couple works full-time for a year, the labor earnings are guaranteed to exceed the federal poverty line. Housing. Shelters to Shutters assists the homeless, veterans, and domestic violence victims. Individuals interview for entry-level property management positions, which offer discounted on-site housing. Temporary support for families in crisis. Safe Families operates in 70 cities in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, and other countries to provide temporary support for families in crisis due to unemployment, homelessness, and other challenges. Their goal is to keep children safe and out of the foster care system and ensure they're able to reunite with their families after the crisis has passed. Safe Families matches children with volunteer host families and provides coaching and other resources. Reducing recidivism. Those re-entering society from prison often face poverty and the challenges that accompany it. According to the Cato Institute's Michael D. Tanner, large numbers of people in poverty are burdened with a criminal record that makes it far more difficult for them to find jobs. The Dannon Project is a community-based program in Birmingham, Alabama, that helps people struggling with re-entry to society, especially nonviolent offenders from prison. Only 3% of the program participants return to prison, compared to the state average of 44%. And Hope for Prisoners is a Las Vegas-based training program for ex-offenders funded in part by the Woodson Center. Program support includes mentoring and skills training to prepare for employment. According to this UNLV study of 522 graduates of the program, 64% found stable employment. Of those employed, 25% found employment within 17 days of the training course. Its recidivism rate is also very low at only 6.3%. Engaging entrepreneurship. As outlined in the Policy Circle's Economic Growth Brief, which you all have access to, business and entrepreneurship represent the largest and most successful anti-poverty program in human history. It is essential to reopen avenues for entrepreneurship as a component of fighting poverty. Expanding access to capital can address poverty by providing a new business opportunity. By one estimate, a 1% increase in the rate of new business equates to 2% decline in the poverty rate, according to AEI. And Opportunity Zones is a program created in the 2017 tax reform. The governors of each state select a limited amount of census tracts that meet the eligibility criteria of distressed communities to receive favorable tax treatment in the form of delayed or forgiven capital gains tax, depending on the length of the investment. The goal is to drive capital and opportunity into communities that lack such investment. Expanding access to capital can address poverty by providing new business opportunities. By one estimate, a 1% increase in the rate of new business equates to a 2% decline in the poverty rate.
So that is, so those are some solutions. I mean, there are many others, and this kind of concludes the brief. And I'd love for us to talk about, to just have a discussion in conclusion as to like what people can do. And actually, before we do that, I'd like to include that we have a brief on creating career pathways, and this is, it's kind of linked to entrepreneurship. I think that within each company, each of us need to be a champion to intentionally create opportunities for those who come from distressed communities, to connect them with jobs that will let them out of poverty. But you need to have within companies, it's not just having entrepreneurship and having a company. You need to intentionally have a mindset to hire and help people lift themselves out and break the cycle of poverty. And that's a challenge in itself. We had this discussion, for instance, at Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs requires everybody in the company to have a college degree. So some of their managing directors are part of these boards of organization to help people come out of poverty, and they can't figure out a way to get them hired by Goldman Sachs, right? So that means that requires changing the requirements, the hiring requirements of the whole organization in order to really be part of moving the needle on this topic. So this creating career pathways, I think, is a whole other topic for entrepreneur to really look at, as to how your business and you and your business can make a difference. But Karen, I'd love to talk to you. You are so involved in moving the needle here. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what people can do after reading this brief, what should be their mindset, and you know, how can they engage?
So I think there are a couple things, you know, from my own personal experience. One of the reasons I believe, in addition to the foundation of my faith, is that there were so many people that helped me along the way. I had these impromptu mentors, like second moms that families that took an interest in my well-being. And oftentimes people in poverty have no resources and they have no support base. And if they do, sometimes it's quite dysfunctional. So I think, you know, one of the first things that anyone out there can do is look for an organization. There are many. If you look at that chart, it shows all the different agencies out here trying to help people that are struggling with poverty, to find one that fits your values and one that you can not just contribute. I think you should contribute time, talent, and resources, not just write a check. Because people in poverty need to know that other folks in the middle class and the wealthy, first of all, can support and believe that they can get out of poverty. That is a big part of it. That's the first thing. The other thing is I encourage you to get more educated around what the causes of poverty, the differences between the socioeconomic classes, some of the history even in the differences between the ethnic classes on why so many people end up in poverty, and particularly brown people end up in poverty. And understanding that and the history, I think, affords itself to a really interesting and really productive conversation on how to be a part of the solution. The solution is not necessarily only leaving the tyranny of the moment. Yes, we can write checks to get people's lights paid and their electricity not turned off. That's so important. But the real work is when you can help people in poverty change their mindset in programs that are helping people emotionally and mentally. The real work is in programs that are helping families in poverty get to self-sufficiency. I know a couple here in Naperville. I'm not as familiar with those in the city, but if we can move families that are in poverty to self-sufficiency, we have, in essence, which takes 2 to 5 years, by the way, help to break the cycle of poverty for them and their children. So I just recommend that you get educated. This brief does a lot of the work. I'd love to see, Sylvie, the socioeconomic differences added to the brief, perhaps one day down the road. Some of the ethnic indicators added to the brief one day down the road, because I think it helps to paint an even bigger picture.
Yeah, that's right. I think maybe on this podcast, I should invite you and Rudy Payne to actually talk about understanding a framework to understand poverty and add those socioeconomics, those statistics we should definitely, that you mentioned, we'll add them to the brief. There's to engage locally, one of the, each brief come with a discussion guide that guide you through the conversation with several questions that you can ask within your circle. To engage locally also, one of the things that we recommend is to research your elected representative's position on poverty. What's their vision? What's their focus in tackling those challenges? And those could be at the very local level in your city, or it could be at the state, or even federally, what they are doing. And I think it is worth highlighting to your representative, especially in Congress, that you care about an efficient and impactful program, anti-poverty program that aligns across agency. And I think that if many of us share that is something important, our representative in Congress that are part of these oversight committee may start getting the language to really streamline and simplify and amplify the impact of the multitude of programs that are in federal government. So I think that would be something that would be a great conversation to engage with your representative. The other is within your state, we say you can really look on your state or municipality website, and you could search for or follow menus that say community, family and children, public assistance, government services, and you'll be amazed everything that's there. Just on the website for illinois.gov, there are a lot of programs. And I think that's where you can find what the government is doing, and maybe where also the nonprofits organization in your community are doing. But I love how you said, the first thing is to really lend your time and show that you care for someone. And sometimes we forget that how important that human aspect is to really help others.
Yeah, if I wouldn't be sitting in front of you today if there weren't several people around, along my path that took an interest in me as a tall, skinny little Black girl from rural North Carolina that had no idea what the other side of poverty looked like. And I'm grateful for those people. And then, and the other people whose shoulders I stood on to make it and break, maybe put a little crack in the corporate glass ceiling. So I'm grateful for all that. It really does take all of us if we want to make a difference, to make an impact for families and children, as I said earlier, in this poverty continuum.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you for reading this brief and
my pleasure.
Conversation. Really appreciate it. So
thank you so much, Silly. Thanks for inviting me.